Welcome to Somnotales history, where forgotten tales drift through time, and the past settles gently into sleep. Tonight, we journey far back long before the Norse sails cut the fog over icy northern seas. Before longships carried fire and fury to distant shores, there was a land shaped by shadow, silence, and something far more ancient than the Vikings themselves. This is the story of those who came before, and the fear they stirred in even the fiercest of raiders. It begins with mist. Thick, rolling, mist that curled through deep northern valleys and swept across the pine-strewn ridges of an untouched world. There were no maps of this place, no roads, no scripts, no temples of stone, only forest upon forest, and silence so deep it seemed to hear. The people who lived here did not need names the way we understand them. They were known only by whispers carried in the wind, whispers the Norse would one day hear and fear. Among these people was a girl named Ilska. She had no memory of the world beyond the trees. Her village, if it could be called that, was hidden in the embrace of a crescent valley, surrounded by ancient pines so tall their branches never saw the ground. Her people were cloaks of bark, fiber, and bone, their hair woven with feathers and small carved stones. They did not speak much, for language to them was not just words, but rhythm, heartbeats, the calls of birds, the rustle of trees. They listened more than they talked. It was said the forest taught them everything they needed to know. Ilska was small, quiet, and always watching. She moved like smoke, unnoticed even by the wolves that prowled at dusk. Her grandmother, Moria, was the oldest in the valley and carried the stories of their kind, not in scrolls or carvings, but in her breath. Every evening she would sit before a low burning fire and whisper legends, not to entertain, but to pass knowledge, the way stones pass warmth at night. Ilska sat near her that evening, her knees drawn to her chest, listening. Moria's voice was thin but steady. There was a time, she began, when the sky was red for 7 nights. The rivers stopped flowing, the birds vanished, and then the strangers came. They brought iron, fire, words we didn't know, and they feared us. Ilska tilted her head, curious. Why? Moria looked past her into the forest. Because we knew the land better than they knew the sword. This was not just a story, it was memory, a warning, folded into time. Generations before Ilska's, the tribe had faced outsiders, warriors from the western sea, tall and golden-haired, with iron blades, and ships that seemed to eat the shore. They came to conquer, but they had found something else. They had found people who melted into the forest like mist, hunters who could see in the dark, who knew the paths of wind and soil, who spoke to the crows and vanished before arrows could find them. The invaders had not stayed long. Their bones fed the moss now, deep under roots that remembered everything. Ilska felt something stir in her, something old and heavy, like the weight of a memory not hers. That night she did not sleep, but stood beneath the trees, listening to the wind. It carried no words, but she felt it. Something was coming again, far to the west, across the jagged coastlines and fractured fjords. A new hunger stirred. The Viking clans had not yet become an empire, but the raiding had begun. Small bands of Norsemen, restless and bold, followed the pull of the sea into unfamiliar waters. They sailed past jagged rocks, past great cliffs that bled water, and they came upon lands so quiet, so untouched, it made even hardened warriors uneasy. One such band was led by a man named Edvin, broad-shouldered, flame-haired, his beard woven with tiny animal bones. He was no king, but his axe had made him feared among his own. He had sailed with 30 men in a long, narrow boat carved with snarling beasts. They had left the cold shores of Rogaland behind in search of something more, rumors of a forest people who carried no iron, yet never lost a battle. To Edvin, that was impossible. How can they fight with no swords? One of his men had scoffed. Witchcraft, may. Edvin only smiled. Then we'll cut their magic in half. But as their ship pushed inland, guided by narrow rivers that wove like silver threads through thick forest, their laughter grew thinner. The air changed. It smelled of damp earth and pine, and something else, something metallic, though no iron had been touched. The birds had vanished. The wind grew hushed. We are watched, murmured Oscar, a young raider whose hands never stopped twitching. I can feel it. Edvin said nothing, but his grip on the tiller tightened. By the time they reached the deeper inlets, they had seen no villages, no people, no signs of fire or fence, only trees, so thick they seemed to lean in, and shadows that did not always match the shape of branches. They camped by the river, lighting torches that hissed against the damp night. Edvin ordered sentries, but they never saw what came. A howl broke the silence, first not a wolf, but something stranger, low and guttural like the earth itself groaning. Then the torches flickered, as if air had been sucked from the world. One man cried out, pointing into the trees. But there was nothing, only a flicker, a shadow where none should be. Another man vanished while relieving himself behind the camp. They found his body at dawn, eyes wide, no wound, as if fear itself had killed him. Edvin had faced men with swords, with fire, even with curses. But this was different. The enemy had no form, no voice, only silence that pressed in like a blanket. Still, he would not leave. Back in Ilska's valley, the forest had changed too. The birds flew in tight, frantic circles. The deer no longer came near. Moria watched the moon one night and said only, "They're here." Ilska was sent into the eastern wood, where an old watchbow stood little more than a rise in the earth, with a shallow pit, and a clear view of the narrow trail that cut through the trees. From there, she saw them, pale men with metal and fur, stumbling through the underbrush, swinging blades at shadows. She did not move. Her breath matched the trees. Her eyes became part of the moss. And when the last man passed, she slipped down and followed. They had set up another camp, deeper now, close to the sacred stone, a great, moss-covered monolith older than any memory. Her people never approached it, but the strangers were drinking beside it, laughing, sharpening blades. One of them had defaced the stone with the crude mark, not knowing what he had done. The forest held its breath. That night, fog rolled in fast, too fast. The air grew thick, and with it came the voices, not words, but vibrations. A low hum, deep and ancient, that made men clutch their ears. Ilska watched from the trees. She did not speak. She did not blink. When morning came, only 2 of the 30 men remained. One was Edvin. The other did not wake. Edvin staggered to the river, his eyes hollow. He dropped his axe, his hands trembling. He had not been wounded, but he was broken. He would never speak of what he saw. He carved a warning into the wood of his ship before he fled. Do not follow the mist. Ilska returned home before dawn, her cloak damp with dew, her feet silent on the forest floor. Moria was waiting. What did you see? She asked. Ilska paused. Fear. Moria nodded, her face unreadable. Then they've remembered. In the years that followed, the Norse would tell stories of spirits in the forest, of silent people who could kill without touch. They called them ghosts, witches, forest demons. But they were wrong. These people were real. They had no need for iron. The land was their weapon. The wind was their ally. And fear was their legacy. And so the forest remained untouched. For even the bravest warriors knew that some places are not meant to be conquered. Some people are not meant to be understood. And some fears, once stirred, never sleep again. The river where Edvin's men had fallen ran cold through the heart of the forest, winding like a living thing beneath a canopy so thick the sky barely touched the water. On its banks, where footprints had once marked the presence of warriors, silence now reigned again. The trees whispered among themselves, leaves turning with a rustle like breath, as if recounting what had happened in the night. Edvin's longship drifted back into the western sea, with only one oarsman alive to guide it, his own trembling hands barely able to pull the blade of wood through the still water. His eyes, once sharp and proud, now stared endlessly into the distance, as though trying to see beyond what memory would allow. He had not spoken since the mist came. He would never speak of the forest again. Far back in the valley, Ilska sat, cross-legged beside her grandmother, silent in the early light. The fire before them was low, burning with a slow crackle that matched the rhythm of the wind outside. Smoke rose lazily and twirled into the cold air above. "There are stories," Moria whispered, "not to instruct this time, but to remember. Old ones, long before the ships, before the blades, before even language. There were others who came from the north, tall, cruel, thinking the world theirs to take. They vanished too." Ilska watched the flames and asked softly, "Why do they always come?" Moria looked at her. "Because they do not believe the old powers still live." The tribe was not a tribe in the way history would define it. There were no banners, no kings, no written scrolls. Only a collective memory that passed from one breath to another, an understanding between souls that had never needed ink to bind their truths. Their power was not war but presence. Their strength came not from numbers but from silence and from the land, which cradled them as its own. Ilska was changing. Not in body, she was still small, still light as wind but inside. Since the night she had followed the warriors, something in her had awakened. She heard the trees more clearly. The wind now carried meaning, not just sound. The animals did not fear her steps. It was time for her first journey alone. Before dawn the next morning, she was given no words, only a look from Moria, and a pouch, made from deer skin filled with salt, dried roots, and a shard of obsidian. She took it without question, and disappeared into the eastern woods, where the moss grew thickest and the trees leaned inward, forming dark corridors of green and shadow. The path she followed was not marked by stones or cuts in bark, but by memory echoes that pulled her through the forest like the flow of water. She walked without hurry, without fear. Birds watched her pass. A fox blinked at her from beneath a fern and then disappeared into the undergrowth without sound. Hours passed unnoticed. Time in the forest was not measured by sun or moon, but by change, the scent of the air, the density of silence, the taste of dampness rising from the soil. She walked until she reached the place all her people feared, though they never said so. It was a circle of standing stones, 5 massive monoliths older than any living soul, cracked with age, blanketed in lichen and moss. In the center, a hollow had formed, filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. This was not a place of worship. It was older than that. It was a memory carved in stone, a place where time folded in on itself. Ilska stepped into the ring and sat, placing the pouch beside her. She did not speak. She did not need to. The forest listened. Far away along the coastlines, where the fjords met the sea, rumors spread. Edvin's return had caused unrest, not because of what he said, for he had said nothing, but because of what he didn't. The silence of a once fearless raider spoke louder than any saga. Chieftains whispered in fire-lit halls about the forest people, the ghosts of the east, the tribe with no name that killed without blade or fire. Some dismissed it as madness. Others saw opportunity. Among them was a young seafarer named Tryggvi, eager, bold, and untouched by fear. He heard the tale of Edvin and laughed. He lost his mind in the fog. He said over roasted goat and sour mead, "I will sail and return with their heads mounted on the prow." He gathered a crew of 40 strong men, restless in winter, their axes sharp, their tempers sharper. They carved a new longship with the serpent's head, and called it Stormtail. They launched in late spring, when the waters ran high and the rivers opened wide. Their plan was simple: land deeper inland, avoid the coast where Edvin had failed, and strike before the tribe could vanish into the trees. But Tryggvi did not understand the forest. He did not understand that the silence was not a void but a presence, that each footfall was felt, that every breath was heard. Ilska remained in the stone circle for 3 days and nights. She did not eat. She did not sleep. The forest fed her in ways the body does not understand. She was not alone. Shadows moved outside the circle, deer, with eyes that glowed in moonlight, birds that did not sing, but watched, and other things, older things. Her people believed the forest had memories, and in that place, they breathed with her. On the 3rd night, the mist came again. It rose from the ground, thick and heavy, curling like smoke with a mind of its own. It wrapped around the stones, whispered through the trees, and spilled down toward the river, where Tryggvi's men had just landed. They disembarked with noise and steel, torches lighting the undergrowth. They chopped trees, shouted, disturbed nests, and trampled paths without meaning. They thought they were claiming ground. They didn't see the eyes watching from above. Ilska rose as the mist thickened. Her fingers traced the obsidian shard, and she whispered not a spell, not a command, but a rhythm. One the trees understood, one the wind had known long before words. The raiders made camp near a pool fed by the river's fingers. They built fires too large, laughed too loudly, sharpened weapons as though metal would protect them from what they could not name. But the mist grew denser. Their fire crackled low, despite the wood. The warmth faded. The shadows grew longer. Then the silence fell. One by one, the men stopped talking, staring into the forest. The sounds of insects, birds, even wind gone. Only the crackle of fire, faint and strange. It was unnatural, too quiet. Tryggvi stood slowly, axe in hand. "Form up," he said. "Now." But the men couldn't move. Not from fear, but from weight, the air itself pressing down. Then they saw them. Not fully, only glimpses. Shapes in the mist. Faces painted with ash. Eyes black as obsidian. No sound, no words, just presence, like stone come to life. Then the lights went out. When dawn returned, half the men were gone. No blood, no bodies, just missing. Tryggvi remained, kneeling in the dirt, his hands covered in ash, his eyes vacant. His ship was gone, unmoored, adrift. Only a crow perched beside him, watching. Ilska returned to her people with no celebration. There was no triumph in victory, for this was not war. It was memory restoring itself. Moria met her by the fire. "Did they see you?" she asked. "No," Ilska said. "Only what the forest allowed." Moria nodded slowly. "Then they will return." And they would, again and again, drawn by curiosity, hunger, conquest. But each time, they would leave, changed, or not leave at all. Because long before the Norse sagas were ever sung, long before the names of kings were carved into stone, there were people who lived not in castles, but in quiet, not by the sword, but by stillness. And their story was not one of conquest, but of survival, so perfect, so seamless, that even history forgot to write them down. But the forest remembers, and Ilska was no longer just a child. She was the forest now. The days grew longer as spring unfolded across the northern wilds. Snow retreated up the mountainsides, leaving behind thawed moss, damp earth, and the return of color to a landscape long wrapped in gray. But deep within the forest, the change was subtle. The people of the valley, those without name to outsiders, did not follow the same calendars as coastal clans or trading cities. They marked time in different ways. By the silence of owl nests, the slow turn of lichen on stone, the moment a certain flower bloomed in the dark of the tree roots. To them, time was not linear. It was circular, like the rings in wood, repeating and folding upon itself. Ilska had returned from the stone circle, changed, though no one spoke of it. Her eyes no longer searched, they already knew. Her steps no longer paused, they simply flowed. In the days following the retreat of the invaders, she spent more time alone, slipping deeper into the hidden places of the land, listening to what only she seemed to hear. She was no longer only a watcher. She had become something else, something the forest itself recognized. There was a stillness to her now, not unlike Moria's but sharper, not tired with age, but focused, alert, as though every movement she made rippled through the trees. It was on one of these quiet walks, just before dusk, that she came upon the sign. A tree tall, unbroken, still green had been marked, not by weather, nor by animal, but by hand. A crude rune, deeply etched with something metal. The symbol was unfamiliar to her people, but it smelled of salt and fire. The forest did not take kindly to metal. The mark bled sap, thick and sticky like tears. She pressed her fingers against the wound and closed her eyes. Far away, across the eastern ridge, where the forest gave way to thin grassland and streams, another ship had arrived. Unlike Edvin's or Tryggvi's, this one bore no serpent on its prow. Its shields were darker, its crew quieter. These men wore darker leather, fewer ornaments, and their leader, a man named Halvard, did not laugh loudly or boast. His face was lean, shadowed, the kind that smiled without warmth. He had heard the stories, not only the failed raids of his peers, but the older stories, the forbidden ones, tales of a place so old it could swallow names. Halvard was not after glory, he was after knowledge. His people, though raiders by blood, had also been collectors of relics, stories, lost crafts. They believed that power could be found in forgotten things. And if this forest held anything forgotten, he would find it. His crew numbered 20, but unlike the reckless warriors before him, Halvard brought men trained in silence, men who hunted more than they fought. They disembarked without fire set, no torches, and moved with a strange respect, as if they already felt the presence of something greater than themselves. Ilska followed the thread. She moved along ridges and moss-covered banks, through ravines and up wooded hills. The earth beneath her feet told her more than words ever could. She could feel their presence, new footsteps, faint shifts in wind, the way a branch leaned just slightly away from something unseen. She was not afraid, but she was wary. These men were different. Back in the village, Moria had lit no fire that evening. She sat instead before a flat stone, arranging bones in a spiral pattern, small animal bones, cleaned and polished, used not for spellcraft, but for reading. Not the future, but the weight of coming change. She did not call for Ilska. She knew the girl would not return until she was needed. The new men had made camp near the ruins of a settlement that had long since melted into the forest floor, ancient and overgrown. Stone walls barely more than lines in the moss now. Halvard stood in what had once been a clearing and examined the base of a pillar, half buried in fern and root. There were no runes, no carvings, but there was presence. That night, as the wind stirred gently through the trees, Ilska approached. She did not show herself. She merely watched, and she listened. Halvard did not speak to his men. He knelt beside the old stones, brushing moss away with gloved hands. He seemed to be searching for something, not a thing, more like a place, a doorway, a meaning, as if he believed something was hidden beneath the layers of silence. One of his men wandered from the camp and found a patch of pale mushrooms growing in a ring. He called for the others to look. Halvard walked over, eyes narrowing. He knew what this meant. In his homeland too, such rings were spoken of, not as food, but as warnings, portals, traps. They did not step inside the circle. Ilska noted this and felt a flicker of something unusual, respect, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. These men were not like the others. They were listening, but even the careful can make mistakes. 2 nights later, they began digging quietly near the base of the old stones. They unearthed broken pottery, tools of bone, fragments of fire-blackened rock. Nothing they understood. Halvard ordered the artifacts packed carefully. He would take them back, study them, perhaps sell some to the monks far to the south who paid well for such relics. But in digging, they broke a root. Not just any root, but a binding. The forest exhaled. It was not angry. It did not roar. But something shifted. The air grew dense. The birds fell silent again. Ilska was already moving. She climbed the higher ridge above their camp and stood in the shadow of a tree older than memory. She placed her hand against its trunk and waited. The tree told her everything. That night, fog came not from the river, but from the ground itself. It crept up like breath from below, cold and slow, covering the camp in pale sheets. The men stirred, some waking, others frozen in strange dreams. Halvard stood first, blade in hand, but not raised. He knew better than to swing at mist. A figure appeared, not fully, only a shape at the edge, small, slight, with hair like ash and eyes dark as stone. She said nothing. She did not move. She only watched. Halvard lowered his blade slowly. "Who are you?" he asked, but she did not answer. The forest did. A low sound rolled through the ground, not thunder, but pressure. A deep groan from the roots themselves. The moss began to steam. The stones trembled. Ilska turned and vanished. Not in fear, but in closure. She had seen enough. In the morning, Halvard's camp was undisturbed. No one had died. No weapons were lost. But everything they had uncovered, the artifacts, the tools, the fragments, were gone. Reclaimed. The soil had closed again. The forest had taken them back. Halvard looked into the trees and understood. This place was not his to take from. He gathered his men. They left in silence, not because they were defeated, but because they were permitted to go. That was a lesson older than war, older than conquest. Ilska returned to Moria's side just as the sun crested the ridge. She sat beside the elder without a word. Moria did not ask questions. She only passed a small bowl of warm broth and said softly. They listened. Ilska nodded once. Not enough. The fire crackled gently, and somewhere far across the cold waters, another chieftain would soon hear the tale, not of a battle, but of a forest. Not of gold, but of fear. And he would wonder whether it was worth the risk to go where even silence had rules. But silence, as the old ones knew, was never empty. It always listens. And sometimes it answers. Mist clung low to the forest floor, not from any storm or morning chill, but as though the very breath of the land had slowed. The trees stood still. Even the birds that usually stirred at first light remained quiet. In the heart of the valley, Ilska stirred beneath a woven canopy of bark and hide, blinking slowly as shafts of pale light filtered through tiny cracks in the shelter above her. Her body had rested, but her spirit had been elsewhere, deep among roots and stone, wandering the inner paths of the old ways, where time moved in a circle and voices long buried still spoke in silence. She stepped outside, her bare feet pressing into the cool moss, and looked to the ridge. The wind moved like a whisper, touching only the uppermost leaves. Somewhere far beyond that line of green, new presence was moving, unfamiliar, but not unexpected. The forest had already told her. It began, as it always did, with stories, not from her people, but from those who lived on the edges of maps. The Vikings had not yet become a single force, no great king ruled them all. But word still traveled across long winters and storm-split seas. And now, the stories of the forest were spreading once more. From the coast of Son to the far inlets of Turndalat, skalds whispered of the nameless land to the east, where warriors vanished and ships returned empty, where the trees watched with eyes unseen, and the air itself turned against you. At first, many laughed. They called it a tale for children, fear born from cold and fog. But those who had met Edvin after his return knew better. They had seen the way he stared at nothing, the way he flinched when pine needles rustled. And he was not alone. Tryggvi had vanished entirely. And now, it was the turn of another. His name was Bjorn Eldskin, a war leader from the southern fjords, born of fire and blood. His name meant firehide, for the red cloak he wore a trophy. Taken from a burning monastery, he did not fear the forest. He laughed at stories of ghost tribes and forest spirits. To him, fear was something you gave to others, not something you received. He assembled a war band of 50 men seasoned in raids, men who had seen the monasteries of the Irish coast crumble, who had plundered silver from Frankish towers, and sung victory songs under red moons. They carried iron-tipped spears, axes heavier than bone could bear, and armor stripped from fallen warriors. They brought dogs, 2 black, lean, trained to sniff and tear. They did not come quietly. Ilska heard them before they reached the river. Not the sound of feet or the bark of dogs, but the way the trees responded. Their leaves curled more tightly. The birds flew lower, seeking quiet. Even the insects retreated. She crouched near the edge of the valley, where the land dipped, and the water moved slow and deep. From her place beneath the roots of an old ash tree, she watched them pass. They marched not like explorers, but like invaders, torches raised even in daylight, iron clanging with each step, shouting at one another as though volume could chase away the unknown. These men would not listen. They crossed into the forest, cutting branches, marking trees with bright red paint, tying strips of linen around trunks as waymarkers, as if they expected to retrace their steps. But the forest was not a trail to follow. It was a presence, and it had seen them. Bjorn set up his camp near a rise in the land where old stones had once stood. The stones were gone now, swallowed by soil and moss, but the earth remembered. They built fires too close together. They felled trees without care. The dogs barked into the night, chasing shadows that didn't flee. Ilska watched from a low ridge, cloaked in bark fiber and soot, nearly invisible beneath the hanging branches. She knew what would happen. Her people would not need to lift a hand. That night, the wind stopped. The dogs grew silent first, then the men, not all at once, but gradually, like a song fading into the end of its last note. Some looked around, others gripped their weapons. The fire cracked too loudly in the stillness. It was unnatural, that kind of silence. And then the forest began to speak. Not in words, in memory. The air thickened not with fog this time, but with pressure, as if the trees themselves leaned closer, as if the ground waited. Bjorn stood, shouting commands, but no one answered. His voice did not carry. It vanished into the hush like smoke in windless air. Then came the shapes, tall, thin, neither fully seen nor fully imagined. They moved between trees as if walking behind a veil, eyes like coals left in a dying hearth. They did not threaten, they did not strike, but every man who saw them froze. His thoughts pulled from him like steam. Ilska closed her eyes. This was not punishment, it was warning. By morning, 12 of Bjorn's men had vanished. No blood, no signs of struggle, just empty bedrolls, dropped weapons, and silence. Bjorn raged. He blamed the fog, the dogs, his own men. He gathered those who remained and pushed deeper into the forest, seeking a fight. "Face me," he shouted to the trees, axe held high. "If you are gods, strike. If you are beasts, bite." But the forest did neither. Instead, it changed. The trees shifted. The paths grew strange. The way back disappeared. His men began to whisper of being followed not by people, but by things in the air, shapes that moved in the corner of vision. One man claimed the shadows of the trees didn't match the direction of the sun. Another refused to speak at all, his eyes wide and mouth clamped shut. Ilska followed them only briefly now. The forest did most of the work. She moved unseen, as did others of her kind, figures hidden behind bark, under branches, beneath the earth. They did not ambush. They did not kill. They simply watched and reminded. By the fifth night, Bjorn had lost most of his men to desertion, madness, or silence. Only a handful remained, trudging in circles, sleep-starved, eye-sunken. They saw movement where there was none. They struck trees thinking them enemies. They wept without understanding why. Bjorn collapsed near a stream that fed the sacred valley. He drank deeply, not knowing the water flowed from beneath the ancient stones. It was not poisoned, but it remembered. When he woke, the last of his strength gone, he saw her just once. A girl, pale, unmoving, standing among the ferns. Her eyes were not cruel. They were not even angry, only calm. He lowered his axe and whispered, "What are you?" She did not answer, because there were no words for what they were. The next day, the forest opened its paths again, and the last survivors of Bjorn's warband found the river. Their ship was still moored where they had left it, untouched, as though waiting for them to choose whether to learn or forget. Bjorn never returned to the forest. He sailed back to his homeland in silence. His red cloak was gone. His hands trembled when he held a cup. He never again led men into unknown lands, and slowly, the story spread, not as one of defeat, but of boundaries. Not every place is meant to be conquered. Not every people will be remembered in the way we expect. Ilska stood once more beneath the great ash tree, her hand against its bark. The forest was calm again. The balance had been preserved. She was no longer just its daughter. She was its voice. And though the world beyond her valley would go on writing tales of conquest and kings, this land remained quiet, hidden, whole, because before the Vikings ever struck fear into the world, there was a silence deeper than war, and it belonged to them. Summer had come to the valley, though you would not know it by the usual signs. The people who lived beneath the forest's endless green did not count days by sun or mark the solstice with celebration. Instead, they watched the way the river narrowed in the mornings, how the deer changed their paths, how the insects shifted their tone from hum to buzz. The heat did not arrive in bursts, but in the slow thickening of the air, in the warm scent of pine sap, in the soft stick of moss. Under bare feet, Ilska moved through the undergrowth like a wisp of wind. Her footsteps left no trace, and where she passed, the forest leaned gently aside. The world knew her now, not as an outsider, not even as one of many, but as something folded into the rhythm of the land, a being in harmony with things that did not speak in words. She no longer asked questions. She simply listened. But even as the forest rested in the long warmth of midsummer, the world beyond did not. In the west, where the cliffs rose like broken teeth over a churning sea, a different kind of storm was gathering, not one of weather, but of ambition. There, a council had been called of men with beards like bramble, eyes sharp with greed, and hearts tuned to conquest. They had heard the stories not as warnings, but as challenges. Tales of vanishing raiders and ghost-haunted woods had begun to shift in tone. Superstition turned to strategy. What if the forest tribe held secrets? What if they had power? Not sorcery, but knowledge. Knowledge of healing, of metal hidden deep in stone, of plants that could cure what axes could not. Or worse, what if the tribe controlled something sacred that could be used? The whispers began in longhouses filled with smoke and mead. Send not warriors, but minds. Send not swords, but scribes. So came Eirik. He was not a fighter, not in the traditional sense. He carried no axe, wore no armor, and bore no scars from battle. But he was dangerous in a quieter way. A man of maps, of tongues, of old runes. A man who had studied the crumbling scrolls of southern monks, and learned to listen between the lines of ancient chants. He had read about places where people lived in harmony with the land, and touched by the reach of kings. He had seen what was done to such people, first curiosity, then conversion, then conquest. But Eirik came alone. He did not believe in brute force. He believed in patience. He arrived not on a warship, but on a quiet merchant boat carrying furs, wax, and salted fish. He left his sailors on the riverbank and stepped into the woods with only a staff, a satchel of dried herbs, and a notebook made of stitched leather pages. He did not mark his trail. He did not speak aloud. He moved slowly, carefully, eyes taking in everything: the curve of the path, the droop of the branches, the smell of fern. Ilska knew he had arrived long before his feet touched the old paths. The forest had told her, not in alarm, but in a whisper of interest. This man was different. She followed him without being seen. Eirik made no fire that night. He boiled nothing, disturbed nothing, and sat cross-legged in the small clearing he had found, slowly sketching what he saw: the pattern of leaves, the arrangement of fallen pine cones, the way the mist pulled in hollows. He was not afraid, but he was respectful. That much was clear. And so, a third night, Ilska revealed herself. Not fully, dramatically. She simply stepped from the shadows, quiet as the trees, and stood just at the edge of his camp, a small figure with eyes like ancient water, deep, still, unreadable. Eirik looked up. He did not startle. Instead, he set his charcoal down gently, and raised his hands, palms outward, empty. He said nothing. Ilska studied him. No weapon, no armor. His body was thin, pale from indoor study, his hair tied back with twine. She could hear his heart, a soft, steady rhythm. Not fear, curiosity. At last, he spoke. His voice was low, respectful. I seek only understanding. She did not respond. He lowered his eyes, then nodded slowly. If I have trespassed, I will go. But she did not send him away. Instead, she turned and walked into the trees, glancing back only once. He followed. For many days, she led him through the forest, not always visibly, sometimes only through signs. A broken twig, a line of stones, the sound of a bird that should not sing. In that hour, Eirik followed, recording nothing now, just absorbing. He saw places untouched by axe or fire, stone circles blanketed in fern, streams so clear he could see the pulse of minnows in their bellies. He began to change, not in form, but in pace. His steps slowed, his breath softened. He spoke less. Ilska finally led him to the old valley, not the village, but its outer boundary, where the trees grew wider and older than he had ever imagined. There, she sat upon a low rock and waited. Eirik stepped into the glade and stood in silence. He whispered, "It's beautiful." And it was. The trees arched like cathedral ceilings, their branches laced with glowing moss that shimmered faintly even in daylight. The air smelled of age, of memory, of things long folded into the roots. He felt something shift inside him, something heavy and hard beginning to soften. They stayed like that for some time, and then Ilska spoke, not in his language, but he understood. "You're not the first." Eirik bowed his head. I know, you are not the last. He nodded. Again, then she said nothing more. He remained in the valley for 3 more nights. No one approached him, but he felt them eyes, shapes, presences, not hostile, just aware, as if the forest itself had paused to observe this small man in his moment of stillness. When he left, he took nothing, not a leaf, not a rock, only the silence. He returned to his homeland, thinner, quieter. He told no one what he had seen. When asked, he only smiled and said, "There are things better left untouched." But someone else had seen him leave. A warlord named Hrothgar, a cousin to Bjorn Eldskin, had been watching the rivers for signs. He saw Eirik return alone, unarmed, with no relics in his hands. But the look in Eirik's eyes told him more than words. "There's something there," Hrothgar said. "Something they're hiding." He began to prepare, and so the story turned again, its thread tightening, looping back upon itself. Because for everyone who comes in peace, another will come with fire. Ilska stood beneath the ancient tree once more. She could feel it coming. The forest was shifting again, its rhythm disturbed by distant noise, by hunger not yet close but growing. But she did not fear it. She had seen storms before, and the forest did not break. It only waited. The winds came differently this time. They blew in from the sea, harsh and cold, despite the heart of summer, curling through fjords and twisting down through the hills like a warning long overdue. The forest, too, shifted, not in color or sound, but in energy, a weight pressing low across the moss and stone. Birds flew lower, animals moved in patterns that no longer matched the season. Even the trees seemed to lean more tightly together, branches overlapping as if whispering secrets in a language no ear could capture. Ilska stood upon a ridge, her cloak barely stirring, eyes narrowed against the rising wind. She did not speak. She did not move. She only listened. Far below, where the river forked into 3 pale streams, the next warband was arriving. They did not arrive quietly. Hrothgar the Red came with 70 men and 2 ships, each carved with the snarling face of wolves. Their shields were painted crimson, and their boots stamped with iron. They came with dogs, axes, bows, and carts of provisions. They came not to explore or wander. They came to break what others had failed to touch. He had studied the failures of Edvin and Tryggvi. He knew of Bjane's broken return and the silence Eirik carried back. He had not come to speak or study. He had come to raise the forest to its roots and carve his name into the earth. He brought fire. Ilska had never seen so many torches in one place. The men dragged them like banners through the darkening trees, setting alight the lower brush, driving animals from the wood. The flames caught quickly where they could, leaping hungrily up fallen trunks and licking at the edges of the forest's calm. It was not war, it was declaration. But the fire did not spread far. Even as smoke rose into the canopy, the wind shifted against them, pushing it back. The flame choked itself on damp air and cold earth. Branches snapped closed above the sparks. Embers died in moss that refused to burn. The men muttered. The dogs barked, but would not run. Ilska moved quietly through the perimeter, watching. She did not strike. She did not warn. She only watched, her presence merging with the trees as if she were grown from their roots. She was not alone. The others of her people were stirring now, not in fear, but in rhythm. They gathered where the forest grew thickest, speaking in glances, in movements, in the sound of twigs under heel, and feathers strung from branches. They did not plan war. They did not form ranks. They simply began to feel, and the forest listened. Hrothgar's camp was large, chaotic, filled with restless noise and the thick stench of overconfidence. He ordered his men to split into squads, to mark the land, to capture anyone they saw. "Bring them back alive," he said, "and I'll make you kings." But no one was found. The forest folded back into silence. Each squad wandered farther from the camp, and each night, one group failed to return. There were no bodies, just absence. At first, Rothver blamed cowardice, then sabotage, then the forest itself. He ordered the remaining men to stand closer, to sleep in shifts, to never walk alone. But the silence only grew heavier. One man, a tracker named Sigmund, wandered off during the morning to gather water. He never returned. The next day, his dog came back, whimpering, its fur damp with dew, and its eyes wide with something wordless. And then the dreams began. Men who had never feared anything began to scream in their sleep, thrashing wildly at things that could not be seen. Some awoke unable to speak. Others wept without knowing why. One man fell to his knees during breakfast and began whispering names he could not have known, names of children long buried beneath the forest floor. Ilska watched them crack, not with pleasure, but with understanding. This was not cruelty. This was memory asserting itself. By the fifth day, Rothver had lost more than half his men. No battles had been fought, no weapons raised, just disappearance, silence, and madness. Still, he pressed on. He ordered fire again, larger this time. Trees were felled, torches relit. They piled wood in great stacks and set them ablaze at the edge of the sacred glade. Ilska stepped into the firelight, then not with violence, but with stillness. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her silhouette framed by smoke and pale flame. The men shouted, arrows were notched, dogs howled, but no one moved. She raised one hand. The fire shifted. It did not extinguish. It turned. The wind bent around her, wrapping the flame backward, pulling it down, curling it into itself like smoke. In a sealed jar, the fire collapsed in a hiss, leaving only glowing ash and stunned silence. She spoke a single word. The men did not understand it, but the trees did. And then the ground shifted. It did not quake or rumble. It breathed. A sigh moved through the soil, a long, slow exhale from deep beneath, like the earth itself releasing its patience. Vines rose like fingers. Stones that had not moved in centuries leaned forward. Roots twisted into new paths. The dogs howled once and then ran. The men followed. They fled not in formation, not in dignity, but in desperation. Their iron armor slowed them. The forest closed behind them. Some found the river. Fewer still found their ships. Rothver stood alone in the clearing. Ilska stood across from him, unmoving. He dropped his sword. I do not fear you, he said through clenched teeth. But his knees betrayed him, and the forest answered with silence. He did not die. That was not her way. He would return broken, uncertain, silent. And he would carry with him a story too strange for war halls and mead benches. He would tell of the girl with ash-colored eyes, of a fire that turned against him, of roots that moved, of a land that remembered. And those who listened would begin to wonder, was this forest cursed? Or was it blessed in ways the world had forgotten? Ilska watched the last of them disappear into the trees. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply turned and walked back into the quiet, because there had always been people here. Not ghosts, not myths, only guardians. And the deeper the world pushed into their soil, the deeper the forest would remember who it was. Summer deepened, but in the valley, the warmth did not touch everything. The days grew long and golden in the open lands beyond the forest, where sunlit grasses waved under clear skies, and farmers bent their backs in honest labor. But beneath the canopies of that ancient wood, the light remained thin, filtered, cautious. There were no crops to sow, no fields to tend. Here, life moved differently. Ilska sat near the base of a birch tree, her fingers trailing through a shallow pool, where minnows darted in silence. She could hear the distant calls of deer, the soft movements of bees in the canopy, the hush of roots shifting below. But she could also feel something else now, something older than the raids, more constant than men. It pulls through the stone and stream, a rhythm not made of sound but memory. The forest was waking, not just in defense, but in purpose. She had become its vessel. It wasn't something she asked for, it was simply what was needed. Her people moved around her, but gently, like the way wind moves around a standing stone. They did not speak to her often now, not because they feared her, but because they understood. The girl who once learned at Moria's side had stepped beyond the circle of learning. Now, she was part of the forest itself. When she walked, branches swayed. When she watched, the air thickened. When she dreamed, the animals slept closer. But peace, even for them, was never permanent. Across the narrow sea, word of Hrothgar's failure had stirred the clans not into retreat, but into hunger. If so many had failed to return, then surely something powerful lay hidden in the forest's heart, something worth the cost. Men told themselves stories to make sense of silence. Perhaps the tribe guarded gold. Perhaps an ancient relic lay buried in those woods. A god's tomb, a forgotten altar, something more valuable than fear. And from those whispers rose one more name, Isvard the Black. He was not a young man, nor a brash one. His skin was weathered from sea spray and salt, his eyes pale from squinting into storms. He had no illusions about conquest or glory. He had seen kings rise and fall, and he had no interest in either. But he had heard of the girl in the woods, the silent tribe, the forest that fought without swords, and he wondered not how to defeat them, but whether it was possible to speak to them. Truly speak. Isvard did not come with warriors. He came with a quiet crew, 3 healers, 2 old men who studied bones, a woman who mapped stars, and a boy with no tongue, but eyes like fire. They sailed not in a serpent-prowed ship, but a vessel with no name, its boards marked only with symbols Isvard had carved himself once. He'd seen once in a ruined chapel. Forgotten even by the monks, they disembarked near the marsh, where the mist always rose too early, where birds did not sing at dawn. Ilska felt them the moment they stepped ashore, but this time, the forest did not grow tense. It paused, curious. The people of the valley emerged one by one, standing behind tree trunks, appearing between shadows, not with hostility, but with watchfulness. They had learned, and more importantly they had remembered. Moria was the first to meet them, old now, her hair white as bone and her back more curved than straight. She stood before Isvard with eyes sharp as ever. She looked into him, not at him, and then walked slowly around his crew, studying not their weapons, but their silence. She nodded. They could stay. Ilska watched from a high branch, unseen. She felt no threat from these travelers, only time. For weeks, Isvard and his companions remained on the edge of the glade. They did not push. They asked nothing. They gave what they had: herbs from distant lands, a map of the stars, soft woven cloth dyed with the colors of crushed beetles and sea stones. They spoke little, but listened much, and slowly, her people responded. Children approached first, offering berries and painted stones. Then the elders, curious and cautious, began to speak in their own tongue when Isvard did not understand, but respected. Ilska stepped forward on the 12th night. She said only one word: why? Isvard looked at her, tired but steady. To know. Her eyes narrowed. To use? He shook his head. To carry. She did not speak again, but she sat with them, night after night. They did not ask what she was, or why she never blinked when the trees moved, or how she spoke with the wind and listened to stones. They only asked what the forest remembered, and Ilska told them, not in words, but in stories. She brought them to the ring of stone, to the cave where roots wept, to the place where shadows never touched the ground. And in those silences, Asvard began to understand. This was not a tribe of magic. It was a people in tune with memory. They did not write because the trees wrote for them. They did not build because the land held their shape. They did not fight because the forest defended itself. Ilska showed them how the river changed color when the stars shifted, how certain flowers only bloomed when the sky wept, how mushrooms formed the shape of lost voices. And slowly, Asvard's companions began to learn, but learning invites danger, because stories, no matter how sacred, are never safe. A scout sent by a distant jarl who had once served under Hrothgar saw the fires one night, saw the strangers sitting with the forest people, and he ran back with wide eyes and a tongue full of rumor. They've made an alliance, he said. The girl has joined them. Within weeks, war drums began again. Ilska stood beside the pool where she had once traced minnows, her reflection broken by tiny ripples. The peace would not last, but she had learned too. She did not fear war, because war did not understand what the forest had become. She looked to the west, where the light dimmed not from clouds, but from something gathering beyond the ridgeline. And this time, she would not only watch, she would lead. Dawn broke slow and pale, the light washing over the canopy like diluted milk. The trees did not shine, they absorbed, and beneath their reaching arms, the ground remained cool and dark, holding its breath. Ilska stood at the edge of the glade, her cloak motionless despite the breeze. She looked west, beyond the hills, where distant movement had begun to stir once more. Not birds, not mist, not rain, but people. She could feel them long before the first sounds came, not because of any magic, but because the earth told her. The moss was tighter, the roots more alert, the water moved with new tension. Something was coming, and this time, it was many. Asvard stood near Hrat speaking. He could feel it too. His companions had grown quiet. The boy with no tongue sat by the fire and drew circles in the dirt. The two old men whispered about signs in the bark. The star mapping woman watched the skies, as though the answer would fall from it. But none of them fled. They understood now. This was no place of conquest. It was a place of warning, a place that tested not strength, but presence, a place that did not care what flag you carried, only whether you listened. But those approaching, they had no intention of listening. They were led by Sigurd Wolfcloak, a warrior chieftain who had long sought to outdo his predecessors. He had heard the stories of those who had tried before him and failed. He laughed at their fear. Hrothgar, BG on, Edvin, men who lost their nerve at shadows and silence. He would not make the same mistake. He would not come with 50 men, or even 70. He brought 200, not just warriors, but siege carts, smiths, woodcutters, hounds, and a makeshift priest who carried a bell to ward off spirits. His ships arrived in thunder, and the ground shook with the weight of ambition. They came not for treasure, but to claim claim land, to claim power, to claim dominion over a silence they did not understand. Ilska turned to Asvard. They won't stop. He nodded grimly. No, they don't know how. The people of the forest had no kings, no armies, but they had memory, and that memory would not forget. Ilska walked into the deep woods that day, alone, but not unaccompanied. The trees shifted around her. The light dimmed, not from clouds, but from recognition. The path she walked was one few had ever seen through. The hollow of an elder yew, beneath the root arches of a fallen grove, into a place older than language. Here lay the womb of stone. It was not a temple, not a tomb, just a hollow where time stopped, where things buried never died, only listened. She knelt before the still pool at its center and placed both hands on the surface. She whispered, not a command, a memory, and the ground replied. When she returned, the wind had changed. The leaves no longer rustled, they waited. The invaders reached the outer glades by dusk. They came with fire, ropes, and tools. Sigurd stood tall atop a boulder, shouting orders, calling for scouts to chart the forest. Burn what won't break, cut what won't move. But the forest did not resist. It allowed them and it let them build. For 2 days, Sigurd's men cleared trees, laid timber, constructed defenses. They laughed, drank, barked commands. The silence of the place unnerved them, yes, but they believed it had been tamed. Ilska did not stop them. She watched and waited. On the 3rd night, the bell stopped ringing. The priest was the first to fall ill, his breath catching, his hands trembling. He could not pray. He could not remember his own name. Then, one by one, the dogs refused to eat. The fires would not catch. The meat began to spoil. Still, Sigurd did not retreat. Then came the dreams. Men saw faces in their sleep, faces of people they'd never met. Names passed through their mouths as if carried from other centuries. The ground beneath their tents turned wet, though no rain fell. Tools went missing, arrows warped, ropes unraveled, and then the forest closed, not with violence, with silence. The paths behind them vanished. The wind no longer moved. They could not tell night from day. Ilska stepped into their camp alone. She did not speak. Sigurd saw her and raised his sword. She looked at him and did nothing, but the earth beneath his feet did. A slow hum rose, a vibration, so low it touched the bones but not the ears. The moss began to shift. The wood of the carts cracked. The air thickened like water. Sigurd's men began to flee, not all at once, but in bursts, like birds scattering before a storm. Some screamed. Others ran in silence. Some clawed at trees that didn't move. Others sat and stared into the darkness, never speaking again. But Ilska didn't move. She waited. Only Sigurd remained standing, though his hand trembled. "What are you?" he gasped, and though her lips did not move, the answer came, not a word, not a curse, just the sudden understanding that he had never truly been alone in those woods, that something had been watching, not from fear, but from patience. He dropped his blade, turned, and walked into the trees. He did not return. Asvard and the others remained at the edge of the glade, untouched. They had not come to take, and so, they were spared. That night, Ilska returned to the valley. She lay down beneath the stars, her face calm. The forest, once wounded, now pulsed with renewed memory. It did not forget. It did not forgive, but it endured, because before the world could conquer it, before the Vikings, before kings and crusaders, there had been something stronger than power: belonging. And those who belonged would never be forgotten. The forest breathed differently after Sigurd's retreat, not with pride, nor victory, but with relief. The kind of breath that follows pain, slow, measured, and quiet. For a time, the moss grew thicker. The birds returned to their songs. Even the wind softened as it moved between the trunks. And Ilska, too, softened. She no longer wandered from watchfulness, but from stillness. Her bare feet moved across stones worn smooth by thousands of years, following the same paths her ancestors had walked, and the ones before them, and so on, until there were no names left to count. The forest did not need to speak to her now. She felt its moods the way one feels the warmth of the sun or the chill of mist, passively, yet undeniably. She spent her mornings in silence, her hands pressed into the bark of the old birch at the glade's edge. Her afternoons were quieter still, sometimes spent sitting beside the boy with fire in his eyes, who said nothing, but saw everything. And by night, she lay under a thick quilt of stars, where the air hummed not with crickets or frogs, but with the memory of everything the forest had hidden from the world. It would not last, not because of evil, nor malice, nor some shadow rising from within. But because time itself was not still, beyond the distant rivers and broken fjords, things were changing. Slowly at first, then with the speed of ambition, the sea people were uniting. Small war bands that had once fought over cattle and insult were now forging alliances. A whisper spread among the longhouses, one of unity, of strength in numbers, of a great new order built from fire and steel. Not all believed it, but those who did gathered, and they listened to a man who called himself Ulfric Greythane. He was not a man of legend yet, but he wanted to be. Ulfric had not come to power by fear. He had done so through cleverness, through speaking of peace, of protection, of expanding knowledge, instead of just territory. But behind his careful words sat the old hunger, the same that had driven Sigurd, Hrothgar, and Bg on before him. Ulfric had heard the tales of the forest. He had read what little Eirik had written before disappearing into exile. He had heard of Sigurd's men returning hollow-eyed and silent. He did not laugh at these things. He studied them. He did not want to destroy the forest. He wanted to control it, and so he sent not an army, but a proposal. 3 riders arrived on calm horses at the river's bend. They carried no weapons, just a sealed scroll and the white cloth of parley. Ilska watched them from high in the trees, her body hidden in the weave of leaves. She could smell the ink on the scroll before it was opened. She could feel the weight of it heavy not in words, but in intent. The scroll was offered to the elders. Moria read it aloud beneath the hanging boughs. Ulfric's words were polished, measured, carefully chosen. He spoke of alliance, of mutual benefit, of knowledge shared, of teaching the ways of the forest to those willing to learn. He asked for guidance, not conquest, for cooperation, not tribute. The scroll ended with a line written in finer ink. Let us shape a future that remembers both our songs. There was silence. The people of the forest did not argue. They did not debate. They simply listened to the trees. Ilska stood beside the old birch, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on the bark. She heard no joy in the message, only calculation. Not lies but not truth either. They answered in silence. The riders left, and Ulfric knew. He sent a second message. Weeks later, this time with gifts, herbs preserved in wax, crystals gathered from mountains, silks dyed with ocean ink. He offered a library, temple, even a hall, built to preserve their ways. But it was not preservation he wanted. It was replication, control, understanding without reverence. Ilska walked to the edge of the valley one morning and saw the new path being carved beyond the trees. It was not built by warriors but by workers, quiet men with saws and ropes and carts. No fires, no torches. But the trees wept just the same. It was beginning. Isvard had remained among them, and now he walked beside Ilska as they watched the distant figures laboring under Ulfric's banners. He said nothing for a long while. Then quietly, "He does not believe he is your enemy," Ilska replied, just as softly. "That makes him more dangerous." Ulfric had not sent soldiers, but he had sent ideas. And ideas moved faster than blades. Some of the younger ones from the valley began to ask questions. Why not speak with Ulfric? Why not accept the knowledge, the libraries, the trade? Would it not be wise to protect their history by sharing it? Were they not hiding themselves too deeply? Ilska listened to every question, and then took them into the heart of the woods. To the grove where no bird sings, to the place where mist clings even under sun, to the archway made not of stone but of old twisted roots, blackened by time and memory. She showed them what had been forgotten, the ruins of an earlier people who had once trusted those who came in peace, who had once shared their songs, who had once taught the healing power of bark and leaf. only to see those gifts turned into poisons and tools of war. The forest did not forget. It bore their bones, and the trees leaned lower when she passed, remembering the last time peace had worn such a beautiful disguise. Ulfric's workers reached the outer edges of the glade. They did not enter, not yet, but they began to map. To measure. To send back sketches and soil samples and lists of flora. Ulfric waited patiently. He did not need to fight. He only needed time, because he believed all things could be understood, that the forest too was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. But Ilska knew otherwise. This was not a mystery. It was a memory, a living one, and memories do not like to be rewritten. They came with scrolls now, not swords. Runners appeared at the river's edge carrying long parchment lists, names of plants, diagrams of trees, maps that pressed unnatural angles onto paths that did not like to be named. Ulfric's surveyors had begun not only to record the forest, but to name it, to measure and mark and chart. Ilska knew this kind of danger. She had seen it before, not in her own lifetime, but in the memories passed down through moss and bark and stone. When fire came, the forest could fight. When war came, it could endure. But when the world tried to understand it, to flatten it into pages and lines and letters, it began to fade, not all at once, but piece by piece, like bark peeled away, thin layer by thin layer, until nothing remained of the old shape. The scouts had not crossed the glade's threshold yet. They knew better, but they pressed closer every week. Their presence was like wind under a door, small, persistent, not yet dangerous, but never leaving. Ilska began walking the outer forest again, not just to observe, but to remember, to recall the stories the trees once held. She pressed her palm to the oldest roots. She whispered to fungi that grew only beneath the ferns. She sat beneath stone arches so old they no longer had names. These places remembered the last time people had come to catalog the sacred. They remembered the silence that followed. The forest had survived not by standing tall, but by bending. By waiting. By warning. But this time, the warning would not be enough. In the village, some had begun to ask harder questions. A girl named Lyra, no more than 16 summers, approached Ilska one morning near the stream. "Why do we hide?" she asked, not with anger, but with longing. "Why do we keep our gifts sealed in bark and mud while they build stone towers and mark the stars?" Ilska did not answer immediately. She reached into the water, pulled out a smooth black stone, and held it in her hand. "This stone is from the mountain ridge," she said softly, "a place no outsider has touched. Feel it." Lyra took it and closed her fingers around it. It was warm, almost too warm. "Why?" "Because the stone remembers." Lyra looked confused. "But it's just rock." "No," Ilska said. "It's story, compressed by time. If you cut it open, it will not bleed, but you will still kill it." The girl was quiet after that, not because she fully understood, but because she could feel something in the silence between the words. The line between curiosity and conquest was thin, and it had already been crossed. Ulfric's emissaries now came not only to study, but to offer. They brought bolts of cloth the color of twilight, jars of salt from distant shores, tools shaped like fishhooks that could split even green wood. They built a small shelter just beyond the forest, not as a fort, but as a place of learning. A few younger villagers went to visit, and some came back with questions Ilska could not answer. With silence alone, they spoke of trade, of exchange, of integration, words that felt hollow inside the trees. But one morning, everything changed. Isvard, who had remained ever calm, returned from a walk beyond the eastern grove with something in his hands. It was a page, torn from one of Ulfric's many scrolls. It showed the valley drawn in precise lines, marked with symbols not of reverence, but of division. Dotted lines where paths should be built, circles where clearings would be cut, a square labeled Hall of Learning placed directly over the stone ring at the heart of the forest. Ilska looked at the parchment and felt something shift, not in her thoughts, but in her breath. It was happening, not by battle, but by blueprint. She walked that night, deeper than ever before, to the grove where no footsteps echoed, where even her people rarely went. There, in the folds of ancient roots, lay the last defense, the memory so old it had not been spoken aloud in generations. She sat on the stone, and she sang. It was not a song with melody. It was a vibration, a breath given shape. The sound moved, through the trees like fog, down into the soil, up through the branches, into the stars. She did not know what would come, only that it was time. The next morning, when Ulfric's cartographers returned, their compasses spun, their ink refused to dry, their eyes watered and their hands shook as they tried to mark paths that no longer stayed still. Trees shifted, rocks changed shape, even the rivers went slightly off course. The forest was no longer allowing itself to be drawn. A week later, the Hall of Learning burned. There were no footprints, no torches, just ash and silence and the smell of smoke clinging to the grass. Ulfric sent no retaliation, but he sent a final message, a stone box, sealed with wax. Inside, a perfect carving of Ilska, fashioned from ivory. Her eyes closed, her hands folded, not a threat, a warning. We know who you are. And Ilska knew the meaning too. They no longer wanted her forest, they wanted her. She was the forest now. She had become its story, and for the first time, she felt something she had not felt in years. Not fears Ulf. Because when people try to conquer land, it resists. But when they try to conquer memory, it awakens. And her people were not forgotten yet. Not while she remained. Not while the trees still stood. Not while the stones still whispered her name when the wind passed. The rains came quietly, without thunder or warning. One evening, the clouds were soft and high. The next morning, the forest floor was soaked and glistening, with droplets clinging to the tips of every fern, every blade of grass. The forest drank deeply. The trees sighed beneath the weight of the water, but the silence remained. Ilska sat on the threshold of the stone ring, water dripping from her hair, her cloak soaked through, but her body still. She had not moved in hours. She had not spoken in days. The message from Ulfric had changed something. The forest had never truly cared for human hierarchies or names, but it had listened when the old threats had come. It had hidden when men brought blades and torches. It had misled them and frightened them and waited. But this time, this slow invasion, dressed in kindness and curiosity, this had shaken the old roots. Because this time, the forest was not just defending its trees. It was defending memory itself. Ilska knew Ulfric had carved that ivory likeness of her not just to intimidate, but to understand. It was a statement: we can shape what you are, and that was more dangerous than any axe. For centuries, her people had avoided written words, not out of fear, but reverence. Memory, for them, was alive. It moved through stories told in the breath of elders, through stones arranged by hands, long since returned to the soil. To write something down was to trap it, to steal its living shape. But Ulfric wrote everything. He was building an empire of paper, and paper was spreading faster than roots. That morning, the forest sent her a visitor, not a person, but a bird. It was small, gray, feathered in flecks of soot and silver, and it landed on her shoulder without a sound. It blinked once, then opened its beak. A voice came from it, A woman's voice, clear, calm, unfamiliar. Ilska of the Memory Grove, it said. Ulfric Greythane requests your presence. He comes with no blade, no fire, no army. He brings only knowledge and an offer. The bird shuddered once, then flew away. The forest did not respond. Neither did the wind. But Ilska stood. She walked to the far edge of the woods that day, not in defiance, but in stillness. Her feet sank slightly in the damp moss, her cloak heavy with water. At the place where the trees thinned and the world of men began again, she found Hilfric. He was older than she expected, his beard gray, his frame lean, his cloak woven in the southern style. He stood alone, holding nothing but a staff etched with markings she recognized, not of war, but of sea routes and forgotten lunar paths. He bowed. I've waited to meet you, he said. She said nothing. I've read about you, he continued, but I don't trust what's been written. I'd rather speak face to face. Still, she did not answer. He looked out across the forest behind her. I don't want to destroy what you are. I want to preserve it. I want others to learn it. If you help me, I'll build nothing within your borders. I'll send no more workers, no more maps, only students. Ilska tilted her head. And what will they do with what they learn? He hesitated, just for a moment. Understand it, and then what? Another pause. Repeat it. That was enough. She turned. You think memory can be passed like a coin, she said, finally breaking the silence. But memory must be lived. You cannot write your way into the roots. Ulfric stepped forward. If you don't share it, it will die. No, she said. If I share it with you, it will be buried under yours. He opened his mouth but said nothing. The forest behind her pulsed quietly, as though waiting for her breath to match its rhythm again. She walked away without looking back. Ulfric did not follow. That night, the sky cleared. Stars spilled across the canopy in slow rivers of silver light, and the wind returned with a whisper. Ilska sat with the elders, with Moria beside her, both cloaked in silence. Around them, younger faces leaned in not for answers, but for a story. Ilska told them of Ulfric's offer, of his promise, of his voice, and then, of his silence. Some of them asked if it would be wise to teach the outsiders some of their ways to protect what could be protected by scattering it into the world. Ilska nodded thoughtfully, then stood. She led them down a path none had walked in generations, deeper than the root grows, beyond the owl hollows, into a clearing, where the trees parted into a perfect circle, and the earth itself glowed faintly with moss and time. In the center stood a stone, not carved, not placed. Grown. It bore no symbols, but all who saw it understood. This was the heart. This was the first memory, and it could not be moved, copied, or studied. Ilska knelt before it and placed her hand upon its surface. The others followed, forming a ring. No words, no chants, just breath, presence. That night, they did not sleep. They remembered, and the forest remembered with them. Far beyond the glade, in a hall carved from driftwood and stone, Ulfric sat with parchment before him. He did not write. He only stared at the blank page, because he had felt something too, something he could not record, a presence older than power, and for the first time, he wondered not what the forest was, but what it knew that no one else remembered. Ulfric did not return to the forest, not right away. He sent no more birds, no riders, no scrolls. His workers packed up the last of their tents and withdrew to the stone hall beyond the marshes. The learning shelter, now burned and abandoned, was left untouched, a silent marker in the grass, but his absence was not surrender. He was waiting, and Ilska knew it. She could feel the tension in the soil, the kind that does not scream, but waits beneath the roots like cold iron, the kind of silence that feels like the moment just before snow falls. She no longer felt watched. She felt anticipated. Ulfric was not done. He had simply adjusted his plan. People forget that the worst storms don't shout. They creep in as fog, and the fog came, slowly, curling up from the river one night like breath from some forgotten mouth. It crept between the trees in long, trailing arms. The birds fell silent again. The fireflies stayed hidden. Even the wolves no longer howled. It did not bring danger. It brought disconnection. The forest, once alive with whispers and presence, felt distant, not dead, but muffled, as if some thin wall had been placed between the roots and the sky. Ilska walked through the glade, her footsteps unusually loud. She pressed her hand to the bark of her favorite birch, and felt nothing. No warmth, no echo, no reply. The forest hadn't died. It had been muted. She returned to the elders that evening, her eyes shadowed. The memory is being smothered, she said. Moria, now so old that even her bones seemed carved from bark, nodded slowly. He has found another way, and he had. While Ulfric's hand did not touch the trees again, his voice did. He had sent stories, spoken, not written. He had sent travelers to neighboring tribes, people who had once feared the forest, now told of its potential, of Ilska, of knowledge waiting to be shaped and used and adapted, not destroyed, not even exploited, just reclaimed. And the people listened. Some of Ilska's own kin did too. Younger ones, not with rebellion, but curiosity. What if we taught just a little? One asked. What if we gave them stories that weren't sacred? Another added, they would respect us more, protect us. Ilska listened, but she felt the pressure building, not from anger, but misunderstanding. Ulfric had never wanted war. He had wanted absorption. To make the forest part of his story, and slowly, he was doing just that, not with armies, but with ideas. She walked again to the Heartstone that night, alone. It pulls beneath her hand, slow and dim, not fading, waiting. She whispered into the moss, not a song this time, but a question. What do I do when memory is not enough? And the forest answered, not in words. In scent, a sharp, sudden waft of pine and wet soil, the scent of death, but also of growth, of endings that fed beginnings, of transformation, not destruction. Ilski understood. The memory could not stay sealed, but it could change shape, not in scrolls. In story, she returned to her people and gathered them, not to warn, but to tell. She told a story, not of what they were, but of what they remembered, of a world that once moved with rhythm, not rule, of trees that spoke in thunder and mushrooms that mapped the dead, of water that sang and birds that carried voices, and of a girl nameless who became memory not by guarding it, but by being it. She did not warn them of Ulfric. She did not curse him. She simply recentered the truth, that their power had never been secrecy. It had been presence. The forest did not exist to be hidden. It existed to be felt, and Ulfric, for all his cleverness, would never feel it if he tried to own it. That night, Ilska lit no fire. She walked out beneath the stars with no cloak, no companions, no symbols, just bare feet and breath. She stood at the border of the forest and the world beyond, and waited until morning. And as the sun crested the distant hills, a figure appeared, one of Ulfric's own, not him, a woman, young, bright-eyed, but tired. She carried no parchment, no weapons, just a cup. She offered it. Ilska took it. Inside, water, clear, cold, taken from their river. They drank together. And in that silence, something began again. Alliance. Not surrender. Something smaller. Mutual pause. The first honest breath. And, for the first time in months, The trees stirred, only slightly, but they noticed. Because Ilska had not given the forest away, she had opened the memory, just enough, to remind the world what it meant, not as treasure, not as power, but as presence. And, for now, that was enough. The sun lingered longer now, though its light felt gentler than before. The rains had washed clean the canopies, and the forest glistened with the quiet sheen of late summer, neither bold nor fading, but balanced on the cusp of transformation. Even the moss seemed softer beneath bare feet, and yet, a strange stillness hung in the air, not of danger, but of expectation. Ilska rose before the others, her feet carrying her across the damp ground without direction, yet not without purpose. She had not dreamed that night, but she had not needed to. The dreams had come while she was awake, glimpses of bark breathing, stars flickering in unfamiliar patterns, and a child's hand pressed to stone, not to take, but to feel. Something was changing, not in her, in everything. The girl from Ulfric's court, the one who had brought her the cup of river water, had not returned. She had left no message, no gift, not even a name, but she had left the cup, a simple one, woven from bark fiber and sealed with resin. Now it rested on a flat stone beside the central pool. Ilska had not moved it. She did not need to. The forest had accepted it, and that meant something. The elders spoke less these days, not because they had nothing to say, but because they, too, felt the shift. Moria had begun planting again small herbs that had not been grown in many seasons. Ones that only sprouted when the forest sensed safety. The soil welcomed them. The wind even warmed slightly in their presence. But Ilska knew better than to call this peace. It was an interlude. And somewhere beyond the marshes, Ulfric was still writing. His parchment halls now reached further southward, eastward, out to the coastlines where traders whispered of a new order being shaped not by sword or fire, but by language. People wrote what they believed. They etched it into bone, pressed it into clay, copied it until belief became fact. And in that sea of voices, the forest had no ink. But it had Ilska, and Ilska had presence. One evening, she walked alone to the stone ring, not to call, not to question, but to remember. She lay down in the grass, arms spread, palms to the sky, and simply breathed. The trees above did not rustle, the stones did not shift, but she could feel them listening, always listening. Then something strange happened. A child came out from the village. Not from the forest, from beyond. His steps were hesitant. His hair was tangled, his face streaked with the dust of travel, but he bore no fear, only exhaustion. And in his hand, he carried a piece of bark, pressed flat, with markings that looked like runes but were not. Ilska rose slowly. He looked at her, and he spoke not in her language, but in one of Ulfric's southern tongues. But the forest translated. Not in words, in feeling. The boy had come not to deliver a message, but a memory. She took the bark from him and held it in her hands. It felt warm, alive. Ulfric had found a way to copy the shape of a forest leaf without taking it from the tree. He had created a method, a kind of pressing that allowed a living imprint to be made. The texture, the veins, the shape. And this one was from a tree that no longer existed in his lands. A tree sacred to their people, long gone. He had found its memory, and now he offered it back. Ilska brought the boy into the village. He did not speak further, but he smiled when the moss cooled his feet and the birds circled overhead. He was given a place beside the fire and a bowl of pine root broth. No questions. No demands. He slept deeply that night, wrapped in leaves that smelled of smoke and soil. In the days that followed, others came, not many, just 2 or 3, not scouts, not messengers, just people. One carried stones that hummed in the right rhythm. One brought seed pods sealed in wax, One came simply to listen. Ilska realized that Ulfric had changed his method again. He had stopped sending knowledge. He was sending memory, borrowed, shaped, filtered, but memory nonetheless. It was a dangerous kindness. One morning, the boy woke and pointed to the edge of the forest. Ilska walked with him there, just to the threshold. There, standing not far beyond the trees, was Ulfric. Alone. No cloak, no parchment, just him. Ilska approached, cautious but calm. They did not speak for a long time. Finally, he said, "I've stopped trying to name the trees." She looked at him, waited. "I thought if I named everything, it could protect it, record it, pass it down." He paused. "But some things can't be passed. Not with words." She nodded. "Slowly. Some things can only be carried." He reached into a small satchel and pulled out a bowl not carved, but formed from clay, and shaped by hand. On its side, pressed in soft ridges, was the imprint of a fern, one that only grew in the valley. But this imprint, it had not been taken from a living plant. It had been sculpted from memory. Ulfric offered it to her. She accepted it, not as submission, but as understanding. That night, the elder spoke aloud for the first time in many moons. "The time of hiding is over," Moria said, "not because the danger has passed, but because we have remembered what we are." Ilska stood beside her. "The memory is not fragile," she said. "It is not a secret. It is a song, and songs must be heard, not taught, not written, heard." And so they began to prepare, not for war, not for alliance, but for presence. They would not send scrolls, they would not teach in halls, but they would allow people to feel the forest. To sit among its stories. To be shaped by it. Ilska stood in the center of the ring once more, beneath a sky thick with stars, and she whispered the old truth. We were never meant to be forgotten. We were meant to be felt. And the forest answered with wind, with breath, with memory. The days grew long and warm, and the forest opened gently, as if exhaling a breath it had held through centuries of caution. No great announcement marked the change. No line had been crossed, no truce etched in stone. But things were different. Now, the birds no longer scattered when strangers approached. The trees, once tense at the edges, stood calmly as footsteps passed beneath them. And for the first time in generations, people who were not born in the valley walked slowly and respectfully through the underbrush, not as conquerors, not even as guests, but as listeners. Ilska stood beneath the great ash at the edge of the glade, her eyes closed, listening to the hush of the branches above her. Every sound was familiar: the faint rustle of squirrels darting through ivy, the delicate crunch of old leaves pressed underfoot, the distant hum of bees following invisible maps carved by scent. But there was something else too. Voices. Not loud, not many, but not native. She turned slightly, just enough to see the two newcomers moving carefully through the clearing ahead. They did not speak. One carried a cloth pouch, the other a flute carved from river bone. They paused often, touching tree bark, stooping to examine old stones, sitting still for long stretches as though waiting for something to reveal itself. And, in a way, it did, because they didn't demand it. They didn't ask the forest to explain itself. They simply remained quiet long enough for understanding to arrive. Ilska watched without interfering. There was nothing to teach, not here, not in this place. The forest had always been the teacher, and now, after centuries of silence and retreat, it was cautiously allowing its lessons to drift outward. One of the young ones from the village approached her later that afternoon, wide-eyed and breathless from running. "There are more," he said, "on the northern ridge, just watching. Some of them are lighting fires, but they're careful, and they leave offerings." Ilska nodded. "Let them." "But, shouldn't we stop them?" he asked. "We don't stop breath," she said softly. We only notice when it changes. The elders met that evening in the circle grove, seated not on stones, but on the ground itself. Moss had grown thicker over the last few weeks. Roots had shifted. Even the insects were quieter, as though observing. Warrior spoke, her voice faint, but firm. The world is leaning closer. They are not taking, others said. Not yet, Ilska replied. But they are remembering. She looked down at her hands, stained with sap and soil, and recalled her earliest walk through the heart paths as a child, how she had once touched the oldest tree without understanding its story, and how the forest had allowed her to learn, not by punishment, but by patience. Perhaps the world, too, needed that patience now. In the days that followed, a new rhythm began to hum beneath the surface of the forest. Not of change, but of return. Songs returned to the air, soft ones, hummed by travelers who sat beside still pools and watched the water shimmer. Children born in the south began speaking words that had not been taught in generations, words carried by wind and woven into dreams. Carvings appeared on fallen logs, symbols not written, but remembered. Echoes of meanings that had never been explained, only felt. One evening, Ulfric himself came again, not to the heart, but to the edge. He did not pass into the sacred. He stood beneath the crooked alder tree and waited until Ilska arrived. I haven't brought anything, he said. She smiled faintly. Good. The forest prefers empty hands. He looked older, slower, but not diminished, only settled, like stone softened by rain. I think I understand now, he said. Why it couldn't be written. She tilted her head. Because it is. Writing, just not yours. He looked down. Beneath his boots, the roots of the alder had coiled into strange, graceful shapes, like letters that no one had carved. It speaks, he murmured. But only when we stop talking. Ilska reached into her satchel and pulled out a pouch filled with river sand. She handed it to him. Place it at the base of the tree, she said. He did. And the tree pulsed, not with light, not with sound, just the quiet knowing of recognition. That night, the stars burned low and slow, coals glowing at the bottom of the sky. The forest slept, but not fully. It was resting with one eye open, as it always had. But now, for the first time, it slept without fear. In the days to come, the valley changed, not in shape, in rhythm. A girl from the coast arrived and was allowed to stay. A boy born of two tongues was taught to sit with stones and hear their quiet warmth. Even the birds shifted, nesting closer to the edge, trusting the changed tone of footsteps beneath them. And Ilska, once a solitary keeper of memory, no longer walked alone. She had not opened the forest. She had simply stopped closing it, not for everyone, just for those who came quietly enough to remember what silence meant. One morning, before the sun had crested the ridges, Ilska sat alone at the stone pool. The air was soft with dew, and the trees leaned slightly toward her. She whispered the old phrase, not loudly, not as a prayer, just a reminder. We were not the first. We will not be the last. But we remember. And so, we remain. And the forest answered with the gentlest thing it had ever offered, a single leaf, drifting from the tallest branch, landing on the water without a ripple. Memory, still breathing. By the time the first frost touched the edge of the clearing, the world had already changed. It did not roar into transformation, nor crash through the branches like a storm. It had arrived, as all true changes do, quietly, gently, beneath notice. Only those who remembered the shape of silence could feel the shift. The outsiders no longer sent envoys. They sent apprentices, not to map or measure, but to sit and listen. To sleep beneath the trees and wake without fear. They arrived in twos and threes, bearing no fire, no plans, just hands open and ears attuned. Some stayed for days, some for years. Some wept the first time they walked into the deeper groves, not from pain, but from recognition, as though they had returned to a place they had never seen, but had somehow always known. Ilska moved through it all like a breeze between branches. She no longer needed to guide. Her presence alone was enough to shift the tone of a gathering, to remind the roots and the people both that this was not a time of telling, but a time of feeling. Ulfric had not returned in many moons, but his people had, not to spread his words, but to unwrite them. One, a quiet man with a limp, came carrying nothing but a story. He had once been a mapmaker, tracing coastlines and valley floors, filling gaps with ink and lines. But he had burned his maps before he arrived. He now carried only memory, unwritten, unspoken. He asked to be buried here when his time came, and the forest did not refuse. Ilska stood with him at the stone grove when he first asked, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Burial is not permission," she said. "It's invitation." He nodded, understanding the difference. Around the same time, Moria passed into silence. No illness, no fall, no fear. She simply stopped. One morning, she sat beneath her favorite tree, her hands folded, her breath slow, and by evening she was part of the roots. No ceremony, no tomb, just moss covering her gently. By dawn, Ilska found her there and wept not for loss, but for gratitude, the kind of weeping that makes the earth bloom. The others gathered silently. They did not speak her name. They did not chant. They just listened, and beneath them, the earth hummed low and slow, a sound not heard, but felt in the ribs. The forest had accepted her. The seasons turned gently, as they always had. But even the wind felt different now. It moved with caution near the outer edges, as if sensing that the borders had thinned. There was no longer a strict divide between what was forest and what was not. Everything breathed the same rhythm. Even Ulfric's people had changed. They no longer claimed territory. They offered stewardship. Small groves were left unmarked along the coast. Stones were arranged in silence, not for worship, but for memory. Paths were walked without being cleared, and for the first time, the language of the forest began to show itself not in alphabets or scrolls, but in the hands of those who had learned how to feel. One woman, born far to the east where the sun rose hot and early, came bearing seeds unlike any seen before. She offered them to the forest, not to plant, but to place. The earth took some, refused others. She wept with joy when the first one sprouted beneath the elm tree. Ilska watched it all, not as a guardian, but as a witness, and deep within her, something began to settle, a memory that did not ache, a future that did not threaten, just the slow, steady presence of continuation. But not all stories fade so gently. One morning, as frost laced the edges of the highest branches, a sound returned that had not been heard in many years. Metal on stone, not war, not yet, but a warning. At the forest's farthest western border, where few trees grew and the soil was thin and pale, a new settlement had risen, not by Ulfric's hand, nor his allies, but by a younger warband, one born not from curiosity, but hunger. They called themselves the Stonebacks. They did not come to learn. They came to harvest. They had heard of the forest's softness, of its welcome. They had heard, too, of the quiet girl who ruled it with no blade. They thought her weak. They were wrong. But they did not know that yet. Their scouts began carving paths, cutting through underbrush with steel and fire. They set up hunting camps, took saplings without offering, killed birds for feathers, laughed at the stories of spirits and roots. Ilska felt it immediately. The forest clenched. The air, once soft with breath, now tasted of ashen iron. The roots beneath her feet no longer pulsed gently. They twisted, not in rage. In preparation. She walked to the hearthstone that night and knelt. For the first time in many years, she spoke not a song, but a command. Do not hide. And the forest responded. They came at dawn, the Stonebacks' faces smeared with ash, leather armor stiff with salt and blood. They moved with the confidence of men who had never been told no, who had always taken, and always survived. But they had never taken from a place that remembered. They reached the first grove before sunrise. 7 men, 1 torch, and a blade fashioned from northern iron. They found only silence. The birds did not flee. The insects did not stir. Even the wind withheld its breath. They thought this meant the forest was afraid. They were wrong. Ilska was not there to meet them. The forest met them first. Roots shifted beneath their boots, softening the ground without a sound. Trees leaned just slightly into their path. The air turned thick, heavy, not enough to choke, but enough to confuse. One of them laughed nervously. That one vanished first. An O scream. No struggle, just a soft rustle of branches behind him, and then nothing. The others called his name, but the sound of their voices bounced back, strange and unfamiliar. They moved on, faster now, but less certain. The trees were no longer standing still. Paths that had been clear a moment before were now blocked by vines. Their fire would not stay lit. Their blades rusted at the edge. By midday, only 3 remained. And then Ilska appeared. She did not speak. She did not carry a weapon. She simply walked between the trees, barefoot, her long dark hair trailing behind her like a shadow stitched from the earth. The forest did not part for her. It followed. One of the Stonebacks raised his blade. The others hesitated, but Ilska kept walking, and behind her came the memory. The forest itself, every root, every stone, every breath of moss was awake now. The men could feel it, not as fear, as knowing, as if every inch of soil remembered what they had done. One ran. He was allowed to go. The second dropped his weapon and fell to his knees. He was allowed to stay. The last stood trembling, not with courage, but pride, the most dangerous kind. He spat at the ground and muttered something about fables, and then he was gone. No sound, no scream, just wind. When it was over, the trees settled. Ilska turned to the one who had stayed. He was young, barely older than the apprentices. She offered him her hand. He took it, and for the first time in his life, he listened. The forest forgave what he could not yet name. That night, Ilska sat at the pool beneath the elm tree, her reflection quiet and clear. Moria's stone had been placed near the water's edge, not as a grave, but as a mark of memory. Around it, flowers grew that had never been planted, the kind that only bloomed when something sacred had been restored. Ulfric returned days later, not to speak, but to sit beside her. They said nothing for a long while. Then he whispered, "The Stonebacks have scattered." Ilska nodded. "The forest told me." He looked at her. "It always does, doesn't it? It always remembers," she said. "Will it remember me?" She thought for a moment, then placed a hand on the ground beside her. "It already has." Seasons passed. The forest continued to open, but carefully, like a gate that never forgot the fire once burned beyond it. More came, not all from Ulfric's lands. Others, too, from islands to the west, from the great red deserts, from cities of stone and glass. They came not to conquer, but to remember what they had forgotten. They brought songs instead of tools, dreams instead of maps, and sometimes they left nothing at all, but the forest still remembered their presence. It kept every footprint in the roots, and so did Ilska. Years passed. Ulfric grew slower. His beard turned to snow. He stopped riding altogether. He spent his days walking the border paths, humming songs he had not learned, only recalled. The young who came after him did not call him king. They called him listener. and he accepted it with gratitude. Ilska herself, aged like stone, slowly, steadily, always there. Her hair turned silver, her voice grew softer, but her presence never dimmed, because she had not built anything. She had only remembered. One crisp autumn morning, she sat beneath the great ash tree where the journey had truly begun, and she watched the leaves fall like whispers. Around her, children danced in circles, some from the valley, some from far beyond. One girl asked, "Did the forest always love us?" Ilska smiled gently and said, "It never needed to." And the girl nodded, as if she understood, because the forest had never been a place. It had been a memory, one that did not ask to be believed, only to be felt. As dusk settled over the trees and mist curled around the stones, Ilska lay down in the soft moss. Her breath slowed, her body quiet. She did not speak a final word. She did not need to. The forest would speak for her. It always had. And as the stars turned slowly above the glade, not one soul mourned her. They remembered her, because she had never belonged to legend. She had always been the pause between stories, the silence between worlds, and so they felt her still in the roots. In the wind. In the soft rhythm of memory that echoed beneath every step they took. The girl who had become the forest was never truly gone.